A dedicated teacher risks everything when she quietly breaks school rules to help a student in desperate need. Facing suspension and possible termination, she becomes the center of a community battle. But will the support of her students and their families be enough to save her career, or has her compassion crossed a line that can't be undone? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Mrs. Evelyn Parker had always believed that teaching was more than just delivering lessons from textbooks. It was about making connections and understanding the students beyond the walls of her classroom. Every year she faced new challenges, but one thing remained constant: her commitment to the well-being of her students. She had a keen eye for when something wasn't right, a skill honed through years of working with teenagers who often felt misunderstood. So when she first noticed a shift in Jaden, she knew she had to step in. Jaden was one of those students who didn't cause trouble, which in some ways made it easier for him to disappear into the background. His grades had always been average, and while he didn't speak much in class, there was a quiet diligence about him. But recently he seemed to fade even further. His once tidy homework came in crumpled, late, or not at all. He slumped lower in his seat, barely making eye contact. To most, it might have seemed like typical teenage behavior, but to Mrs. Parker, it was a red flag. One day, as the final bell rang and students filed out, Mrs. Parker's eyes followed Jaden. She could see the weight on his shoulders, the way he moved slower than the others, as though something invisible was dragging him down. She didn't like to pressure her students, but Jaden had reached a point where his silence was more concerning than any verbal confession could have been. "Jaden," she called, her voice soft but firm, "can you stay for a moment?" He paused, his back still turned toward her, before slowly shuffling back into the room. He didn't sit down, but stood awkwardly near the door, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. Mrs. Parker studied him for a moment, sensing the unease radiating from him. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone gentle. Jaden shrugged. "Yeah, I'm fine," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Mrs. Parker had heard those words countless times before from students who were anything but fine. She knew better than to push too hard, but she also couldn't let it go. "You haven't been yourself lately," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Your grades are slipping, and you seem a little distracted. I just wanted to check in and make sure things are all right." For a long moment, Jaden didn't respond. The room was quiet, the distant sounds of students in the hallway fading as the school emptied for the day. Finally, Jaden spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just things at home. My mom's working a lot, and well, things have been tough." He shifted uncomfortably, as though even admitting that much was a heavy burden. Mrs. Parker nodded, her heart aching for him. She didn't need all the details to know what he was going through. Over the years, she had seen students dealing with similar struggles, families trying to make ends meet, parents working multiple jobs, and kids like Jaden caught in the middle, trying to shoulder responsibilities far beyond their years. "I understand," Mrs. Parker said softly, "but I want you to know, Jaden, that if you ever need help with school or anything else, you can come to me. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Jaden nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the floor. Mrs. Parker could see the hesitation in him, the reluctance to open up further. She didn't push him. She had learned long ago that trust took time. The next day, Mrs. Parker packed 2 lunches. She wasn't sure if Jaden would accept the gesture, but something told her he needed more than just her words. As the students settled into their seats, she made her way over to his desk, placing the extra sandwich and apple next to his notebook. "Thought you might be hungry," she said with a smile, keeping her tone casual. Jaden looked up, startled by the unexpected offering. For a moment, he hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. But the other students were too engrossed in their conversations to pay attention. Finally, he mumbled a quiet thanks and tucked the food into his bag. It was a small gesture, but Mrs. Parker knew it was a start. Over the next few weeks, she continued her quiet support. She never made a big deal out of it, just an extra snack here and there, a few kind words when Jaden looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Slowly, he started to open up, though only in fragments. He mentioned how his mother worked late into the night at a job that barely paid the bills, how he tried to help out by watching his younger siblings, and how sometimes there just wasn't enough food to go around. Mrs. Parker listened, offering understanding and reassurance, but never prying for more than he was willing to share. She had learned that sometimes just being there was enough. Jaden didn't need someone to solve his problems. He needed someone to see him, to acknowledge that he was struggling, and offer a hand when he needed it. But as the weeks passed, Mrs. Parker began to worry that her small gestures weren't enough. She knew how these situations could spiral, and she couldn't stand the thought of Jaden slipping through the cracks. One afternoon, as she graded papers, her thoughts kept drifting back to him, wondering if there was something more she could do. Her answer came when she found Jaden's journal. He had left it behind in the rush to get to his next class. Mrs. Parker wasn't in the habit of going through her students' personal belongings, but when she picked it up, a piece of paper slipped out. She unfolded it carefully, her heart sinking as she read the grocery receipt. A loaf of bread and a gallon of milk. That was all Jaden's family had bought, and the date on the receipt was from several days ago. It wasn't much, but it told her everything she needed to know. Jaden's family was struggling more than he had let on. That night, as she sat in her small, quiet kitchen, Mrs. Parker couldn't stop thinking about Jaden. She wondered how many other students were facing the same silent battles, how many of them she hadn't noticed yet. And most of all, she wondered if she was doing enough. She had always believed that teaching was about more than just academics. But this felt like more than she was prepared to handle. Still, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Jaden slip away. The following Monday, Mrs. Parker stood in her classroom, staring out the window as students filed into the school building. She had spent the entire weekend thinking about Jaden. The receipt she found was burned into her memory, a stark reminder of the quiet suffering that often went unnoticed in her classroom. She had always known that many of her students dealt with hardships at home, but seeing Jaden's struggle in such a tangible way made it feel more urgent. Mrs. Parker had always been a rule follower, someone who respected the boundaries set by the school administration. But over the years, she had also learned that following every rule to the letter didn't always align with doing the right thing. She knew that the school had strict policies about teachers giving students money or financial aid, policies designed to protect both the teachers and students from accusations of favoritism or inappropriate behavior. But these rules didn't take into account the real lives of the students, the struggles they faced beyond the classroom walls. Jaden wasn't just a student who needed extra academic support. He was a young man who was being crushed by circumstances beyond his control. And Mrs. Parker couldn't stand by and do nothing. That afternoon, as the students left for lunch, Mrs. Parker called Jaden over. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the room to see if anyone was watching, before making his way to her desk. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Mrs. Parker began, keeping her voice low. "I know things have been tough at home, and I've been thinking about how I can help." Jaden shifted uncomfortably, his eyes dropping to the floor. "It's fine," he muttered. "I'm fine." Mrs. Parker smiled gently, recognizing the familiar deflection. "I know you're doing your best, Jaden, but I also know it's not easy. I don't want to push you into anything, but I'd like to offer a little more help. I know the school doesn't allow teachers to give students money, but I can give you something else." From her desk drawer, she pulled out a small envelope. Jaden eyed it warily, unsure of what to make of it. "This isn't money," Mrs. Parker said quickly, sensing his hesitation. "It's a gift card to the local grocery store. I just want to make sure you and your family have what you need for food. You don't have to take it if you don't want to, but it's here if you do." For a long moment, Jaden didn't say anything. He looked at the envelope, then at Mrs. Parker, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the pride that told him he didn't want charity, and the desperation that made him realize he might need it. "I don't want to get you in trouble," Jaden said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Parker smiled, her heart aching at how responsible he felt for her. You don't need to worry about that. Sometimes, doing the right thing means bending the rules a little." Jaden hesitated, but after another moment of silence, he reached out and took the envelope. He didn't say thank you, but the relief in his eyes said enough. Without another word, he stuffed the envelope into his backpack and walked out of the classroom, his steps a little lighter than they had been before. That evening, Mrs. Parker sat in her living room, staring at the stack of ungraded papers on the coffee table. Normally, she would have spent the evening grading, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She knew she had crossed a line by giving Jaden the gift card, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She had seen too many students slip through the cracks over the years, and she wasn't about to let that happen to Jaden. Still, there was a part of her that worried about what might happen if anyone found out. The school had a zero-tolerance policy when it came to teachers giving students financial aid, and the consequences could be severe. But Mrs. Parker had made her choice. She would rather face the consequences of breaking the rules than the guilt of knowing she could have done more to help a student in need. The next few weeks passed quietly. Jaden continued to improve in class, turning in his assignments on time and participating more during discussions. He still wasn't as vocal as some of the other students, but Mrs. Parker noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. He no longer seemed weighed down by the same invisible burden that had been crushing him before. For a while, it seemed like Mrs. Parker's quiet rebellion had gone unnoticed. She continued to discreetly support Jaden, offering small gestures of kindness, an extra snack, a kind word, and occasionally another gift card when she felt he needed it. She kept it all under the radar, never drawing attention to herself or Jaden. But as much as Mrs. Parker tried to keep her actions secret, the walls of a school are never as silent as they seem. Rumors began to swirl among the faculty. One of the other teachers, Mr. Roberts, a by-the-book type who prided himself on his adherence to policy, had noticed Jaden's sudden improvement. He had seen Mrs. Parker talking to Jaden more frequently after class and had grown suspicious. Though he didn't have any concrete evidence, he suspected that Mrs. Parker was giving Jaden some kind of special treatment. One afternoon, Mr. Roberts cornered Mrs. Parker in the teacher's lounge. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with Jaden lately," he said casually, though there was an edge to his tone. Mrs. Parker looked up from her cup of tea, sensing the underlying accusation in his words. "He's been struggling a bit," she said, keeping her tone light, "just offering him some extra support." Mr. Roberts raised an eyebrow. "Support, huh? You're not bending the rules for him, are you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mrs. Parker felt her stomach twist, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Of course not," she said evenly. "I'm just doing what I can to help a student in need." Mr. Roberts studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Just be careful, Evelyn. You wouldn't want to get yourself into trouble." With that, he turned and walked out of the lounge, leaving Mrs. Parker feeling unsettled. Later that day, as she packed up her things to leave, Mrs. Parker's thoughts lingered on the conversation with Mr. Roberts. She knew she had to be more careful. The school's policies were strict, and if anyone found out what she had been doing, it could cost her more than just her job. But as she locked her classroom door, her resolve remained firm. Some rules were meant to be broken. A week had passed since Mrs. Parker's unsettling conversation with Mr. Roberts, and the tension at school was growing. Mrs. Parker could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, a subtle shift in the way they interacted with her. Conversations would stop when she entered the room, and even though no one had directly confronted her, there was an air of suspicion that followed her through the halls. The quiet rebellion that had started as a small act of compassion now felt much more dangerous. Jaden, for his part, seemed to be doing better. His work was improving, and he looked more at ease than he had in weeks. Mrs. Parker took comfort in that, even as her own anxiety grew. She had crossed a line by giving him the gift cards, and though she knew in her heart that she had done the right thing, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before someone found out. One afternoon, as Mrs. Parker was preparing for her next class, the door to her classroom opened, and Principal Thomas stepped in. He was a tall, stern man, known for his strict adherence to school policies. His unexpected visit set Mrs. Parker on edge. "Evelyn, could I have a word with you in my office?" Principal Thomas asked, his tone polite but formal. Mrs. Parker felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew this wasn't a casual visit. Still, she nodded, trying to keep her composure. Of course. As she followed Principal Thomas down the hall, her mind raced. She had always been careful to keep her support for Jaden discreet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was about him. When they reached the principal's office, he gestured for her to sit, and she complied, her heart pounding in her chest. Principal Thomas sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He folded his hands in front of him and took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been hearing some concerns from the staff," he began. "It seems that some teachers have noticed you've been giving extra attention to one of your students, Jaden." Mrs. Parker's pulse quickened. She had been prepared for this, but now that it was happening, the reality of it hit her harder than she expected. She forced herself to stay calm. "Jaden has been struggling, yes," she said carefully. "I've been giving him some additional support to help him get back on track." Principal Thomas nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "And what exactly does that support entail?" Mrs. Parker hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much she should reveal. She knew that admitting to giving Jaden the gift cards would likely result in disciplinary action, but lying wasn't an option either. She took a deep breath. "I've helped him with his schoolwork, and I've provided some snacks when I noticed he was going without food. He's going through a difficult time at home." Principal Thomas's expression remained neutral, but there was a shift in his eyes, a flicker of something that Mrs. Parker couldn't quite place. He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with a measured gaze. "I understand your desire to help, Evelyn," he said after a long pause. "But you're aware of the school's policies. We have strict guidelines for a reason. It's not just about the rules. It's about protecting both the students and the teachers." Mrs. Parker nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. She knew what was coming next. "Some of your actions, particularly providing financial aid to a student, have raised concerns," Principal Thomas continued, his tone firm. "There are strict boundaries in place to prevent favoritism or any perception of inappropriate conduct. The administration has decided to open an investigation into the matter." The words hit Mrs. Parker like a punch to the gut. An investigation? The knot in her stomach tightened, and for a moment she felt like the room was spinning. She had known there was a risk in helping Jaden, but she had hoped it wouldn't come to this. "An investigation?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Principal Thomas nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand this is difficult, Evelyn, but we have to follow protocol. During the investigation, you'll be placed on temporary leave." Mrs. Parker stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. Temporary leave? She had never even considered the possibility that things would escalate this far. The thought of being removed from her classroom, of not being able to teach her students, and worse, not being there for Jaden, was overwhelming. Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Principal Thomas's face softened, but his tone remained firm. "It's out of my hands. The school board will be handling the investigation. In the meantime, I would advise you to take this time to reflect. You've been a valuable teacher here for many years, Evelyn, and I believe your heart is in the right place, but we have to follow the rules." Mrs. Parker didn't say anything. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the consequences of her actions crashing down all at once. She had always prided herself on doing the right thing, on standing up for her students, but now it felt like that very compassion had turned against her. When she left the principal's office, her mind was a blur of emotions: anger, fear, regret. She felt like she had failed, not just herself but Jaden as well. How would he react when he found out that her efforts to help him had led to this? And what would happen to him now that she wouldn't be there to support him? As Mrs. Parker packed up her things, she tried to focus on the positives. Maybe the investigation would clear her name. Maybe the school board would understand why she had done what she did. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Later that day, when Jaden came to class, He noticed immediately that something was wrong. Mrs. Parker wasn't her usual self. She was quieter, more distant, as if she was holding something back. After class, he stayed behind, waiting until the other students had left before approaching her. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Parker?" he asked, his voice tentative. She looked up at him, her heart heavy. She had always been honest with her students, and she wasn't about to start lying now. "Jaden, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The school is conducting an investigation, and I've been placed on temporary leave. I won't be here for a while." Jaden's face fell, his eyes widening in shock. "What? Why?" Mrs. Parker took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "It's because of the support I've been giving you. Some people feel that I crossed a line by providing financial help, and now they're looking into it." Jaden stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and guilt. "This is my fault," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never should have accepted your help." Mrs. Parker shook her head, reaching out to gently place a hand on his shoulder. "No, Jaden, this isn't your fault. I made the choice to help you because I believed it was the right thing to do. You did nothing wrong." But Jaden didn't look convinced. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Mrs. Parker could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he blamed himself for what had happened. "I'm sorry," he whispered, before turning and walking out of the classroom. Mrs. Parker watched him go, her heart aching. She had hoped that helping Jaden would lift him up, but now it felt like her actions had only added to his burden. As she left the school that day, carrying a box of her belongings, Mrs. Parker couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice after all. She had always believed in standing up for her students, but now that she was facing the consequences of her actions, the line between right and wrong seemed blurrier than ever. Mrs. Parker's absence from the school did not go unnoticed. In fact, within days, it became the talk of the entire town. News spread quickly, though the details were muddled with gossip and speculation. Some believed she had broken serious rules, others whispered that it had something to do with Jaden, and a few even questioned whether there was something inappropriate about their relationship. The truth was far simpler, but in a small town, rumors had a way of growing legs and running wild. Jaden was feeling the weight of it all. Every day after Mrs. Parker's departure, he walked into school with a heavy heart, guilt gnawing at him from the inside. He knew that her temporary suspension was because she had tried to help him, and the thought that she was being punished for her kindness filled him with anger and shame. At first, he tried to keep his head down, hoping that things would blow over, but it quickly became clear that the other students were starting to catch wind of what had happened. Some avoided him, while others whispered as he passed. He even overheard some students saying that Mrs. Parker had been fired because she had crossed a line with him, insinuating something far worse than the truth. Jaden felt his stomach turn with disgust every time he heard those words. One morning, after overhearing another group of students gossiping about Mrs. Parker, Jaden snapped. He turned on them, his face flushed with frustration. "She didn't do anything wrong," he shouted, his voice louder than he intended. The hallway fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. "Mrs. Parker was trying to help me," he continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "She gave me food because I was hungry. That's all. She didn't deserve this." The students stared at him, some looking guilty, others surprised by his outburst. Jaden, realizing he had drawn even more attention to himself, hurried off down the hall, his heart racing. He had never been one to speak up or draw attention, but the injustice of what was happening to Mrs. Parker had pushed him to the edge. That evening, Jaden sat at his small kitchen table, staring down at the blank piece of paper in front of him. His mother, tired from her double shift, was sitting across from him, nursing a cup of tea. She looked at her son, seeing the tension in his face, and knew something was wrong. "You okay, Jaden?" she asked softly. Jaden shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "It's my fault, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "Mrs. Parker got suspended because she was helping me. Now everyone's saying awful things about her, and it's all because of me." His mother set down her cup and moved to sit next to him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "It's not your fault, Jaden," she said gently. Mrs. Parker made her choices because she cares about you. And from what you've told me, she didn't do anything wrong. She's just caught up in a system that doesn't understand how to be kind sometimes." Jaden nodded, but the guilt still weighed heavily on him. He wiped his eyes and looked down at the paper again. "I need to do something. I need to let people know the truth." With his mother's encouragement, Jaden began to write. It wasn't easy at first. He had never been much for writing, and putting his thoughts and feelings on paper felt intimidating. But as he wrote, the words started to flow. He wrote about Mrs. Parker, about how she had noticed his struggles when no one else had. He wrote about the small gestures of kindness she had shown, the extra snacks, the gift cards she had given him so his family wouldn't go hungry. He wrote about how her actions had helped him stay focused in school and how much her support had meant to him. When he was done, he had written a letter to the school board, explaining everything. But he didn't stop there. Jaden felt that more needed to be done. Mrs. Parker's suspension wasn't just a school issue. It was about something bigger. It was about how people should be allowed to help each other, even if it meant bending the rules sometimes. Jaden's mother helped him draft a petition, and the next day, with a stack of copies in hand, he went to school with a determination he had never felt before. During lunch, he started approaching students, explaining the situation and asking them to sign the petition, calling for Mrs. Parker's reinstatement. At first, there were a few hesitant looks. Some students weren't sure what to believe, given the rumors that had been circulating. But once Jaden told them the truth, how Mrs. Parker had quietly helped him and other students without expecting anything in return, they began to sign. Word spread quickly, and soon, students were approaching Jaden, asking if they could sign as well. The momentum didn't stop there. By the end of the day, Jaden had gathered dozens of signatures, and the petition began to circulate beyond the school. Parents started to hear about it from their children, and many of them, especially those whose own kids had been helped by Mrs. Parker over the years, added their names to the growing list of supporters. The following week, a small group of parents and students gathered outside the school for a peaceful demonstration. They held signs that read, "Bring Mrs. Parker back and compassion over rules." Jaden stood among them, his heart pounding as he held a sign of his own. It felt surreal to him. He had never been the type to take part in a protest, let alone lead one. But seeing the support from the community filled him with a sense of purpose. The local media soon caught wind of the story. A few reporters showed up at the demonstration, and before long, the situation had garnered attention beyond the town. Mrs. Parker's suspension became a talking point in the broader conversation about the role of educators and the responsibilities they had toward their students. Some argued that rules were rules, and Mrs. Parker had crossed a line. But others, many of them parents and teachers themselves, felt that compassion should always come first. Inside her small home, Mrs. Parker watched the news reports with a mix of emotions. She had never sought attention or praise for what she had done. All she wanted was to help Jaden and make sure he didn't fall through the cracks like so many other students. But seeing the outpouring of support from the community, especially from Jaden, filled her with gratitude. Later that week, the school board announced that they would hold a public hearing to discuss Mrs. Parker's case. It was clear that the community's response had made an impact, and the school board was now facing pressure to reconsider their stance. On the day of the hearing, the school auditorium was packed. Parents, students, and community members filled the seats, eager to hear the outcome. Jaden sat in the front row with his mother, clutching the petition he had started, which now contained hundreds of signatures. When Mrs. Parker entered the room, the audience erupted into applause. She was visibly moved by the support, her eyes brimming with tears as she took her seat at the front of the room. The hearing began with the school board reviewing the case. They acknowledged that Mrs. Parker had violated school policy by providing financial aid to a student, but they also recognized the overwhelming community support in her favor. Several parents and students spoke on Mrs. Parker's behalf, sharing stories of how she had gone above and beyond to help them during difficult times. When it was Jaden's turn to speak, he stood before the school board, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Mrs. Parker didn't just teach me math or history, Jaden began, his eyes sweeping across the room. She taught me what it means to care about people. She saw that I was struggling, and she didn't look the other way. She helped me because it was the right thing to do. And if that means breaking a rule, then maybe the rules need to change. There was a ripple of murmurs through the crowd, but Jaden wasn't finished. Mrs. Parker is the kind of teacher we need more of, he said. Someone who cares enough to help, even when it's hard. And I'm asking you, the school board, to see that too. Please, bring her back. When Jaden finished, the room was silent for a moment before another round of applause broke out. Mrs. Parker wiped away tears, moved by Jaden's words and the courage it took for him to stand up in front of so many people. The school board's hearing had drawn the attention of nearly the entire town. Word had spread quickly after Jaden's emotional speech, and by the time the board members reconvened to deliberate, the school auditorium was buzzing with anticipation. People who had never been directly affected by Mrs. Parker's kindness were now invested in her case, not because they knew her personally, but because her story had struck a chord with them. It was a story about more than just rules. It was about compassion, community, and the kind of humanity that can get lost in bureaucratic systems. Mrs. Parker sat quietly at the front of the room, her hands folded in her lap, trying to keep her emotions in check. The support from the students, parents, and community had been overwhelming, and it had given her hope. But she also knew that the final decision was out of her hands. The school board had rules, and while the public's outcry had made an impact, the board still had to weigh the consequences of her actions against the policies that had been put in place to govern situations like this. Jaden sat beside her, his mother on his other side. He was quiet, but the determined expression on his face hadn't wavered since he had spoken before the board. Mrs. Parker glanced over at him, feeling a swell of pride. In the months she had known him, she had seen him grow from a shy, withdrawn student into someone who was willing to stand up not only for himself, but for what he believed in. It was moments like this that reminded her why she had chosen to become a teacher in the first place. After what felt like an eternity, the head of the school board, Mr. Evans, returned to the podium. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone, clearing his throat before he spoke. "We've heard from many members of this community today," he began, his voice steady but serious. "And we've listened to the arguments for and against Mrs. Parker's actions. It's clear that Mrs. Parker is a beloved teacher, and it's also clear that she acted out of a genuine desire to help a student in need." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but Mr. Evans raised a hand to quiet them. "That said," he continued, "we must also acknowledge that Mrs. Parker violated established school policies regarding the financial aid of students. These policies are in place to protect both students and teachers, and while her intentions were good, the rules exist for a reason." Mrs. Parker's heart sank. She had known this would be the difficult part. The rules were rigid, and in the eyes of the school system, they were not to be broken, no matter the circumstances. "However," Mr. Evans said, pausing for effect, "we also recognize that there are times when the rules may not serve the best interests of our students. Mrs. Parker's case has brought to light a broader issue, the need for more flexibility and understanding when it comes to supporting students who are struggling outside the classroom." Mrs. Parker looked up, her heart fluttering with hope. "As such," Mr. Evans continued, "the board has decided to reinstate Mrs. Parker, effective immediately, with a formal warning for her actions. Additionally, we will be reviewing our policies to create a more structured and compassionate way for teachers and staff to assist students in need, ensuring that no student falls through the cracks due to bureaucratic red tape." The room erupted into applause. Jaden let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders finally relaxing. Mrs. Parker sat there stunned for a moment as the weight of the decision sank in. She had expected punishment, perhaps even termination, but instead, the board had recognized the need for change. It was more than she had hoped for. As the applause continued, Mrs. Parker stood, overwhelmed with emotion. She turned to Jaden, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jaden shook his head, his own eyes shining. "You did this, Mrs. Parker. You helped me when no one else would. This is all because of you." Mrs. Parker pulled him into a tight hug, feeling the warmth of the moment wash over her. The crowd continued to cheer as Mrs. Parker was surrounded by students, parents, and colleagues who had come to show their support. It was a scene she would never forget. A reminder that sometimes standing up for what is right, even when it means breaking the rules, is worth the risk. In the days that followed, the town continued to rally around Mrs. Parker. The media coverage had drawn attention to the story, and soon other teachers and schools across the region began discussing similar changes to their policies. Mrs. Parker's actions had sparked a conversation about how educators could better support their students, not just academically, but in every aspect of their lives. Back in her classroom, Mrs. Parker found herself returning to the familiar routine of teaching. But something had shifted. The students, especially Jaden, seemed more engaged, more open. They had seen what it meant to be truly cared for by a teacher, and they knew that Mrs. Parker's door was always open for those who needed help. One afternoon, a few weeks after the hearing, Mrs. Parker stayed late after class, grading papers as the soft hum of the school's air conditioning filled the room. The sun was setting outside, casting a warm glow through the windows. Jaden walked into the room, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by a more confident presence. "Hey, Mrs. Parker," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Hey, Jaden," she replied, smiling up at him. "How's everything going?" "Pretty good," he said, nodding. "I'm actually doing well in all my classes now." Mrs. Parker beamed. "That's great to hear. I knew you had it in you." Jaden hesitated for a moment before stepping further into the room. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." "You don't need to thank me, Jaden," Mrs. Parker said gently. "I'm just glad I could help." Jaden shook his head. "No, really. You changed everything for me. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't stepped in." Mrs. Parker felt a lump form in her throat, but she managed to smile through it. "You're a strong young man, Jaden. You would have found your way. I just gave you a little push." Jaden smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes as well. "Not everyone has a teacher like you. I'm lucky." Mrs. Parker stood up and walked over to him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We're both lucky, Jaden. You've taught me just as much as I've taught you." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them. It wasn't just about the past few months. It was about the years ahead, the difference that one person's kindness could make in someone's life. As Jaden turned to leave, Mrs. Parker called out to him. "Jaden?" He paused at the door, looking back at her. "You're going to do great things, don't ever doubt that." He smiled, his eyes bright with determination. "I won't." And with that, he walked out of the classroom, leaving Mrs. Parker standing in the soft glow of the setting sun, reflecting on the journey they had been on together. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. In the end, it wasn't about the rules or the policies. It was about people. About caring, even when it was hard, even when it meant going against the grain. Mrs. Parker sat back down at her desk, picking up her red pen to continue grading papers. But as she looked at the students' names on the assignments in front of her, she knew that her role as a teacher had always been about more than just the grades. It had always been about seeing her students for who they truly were and helping them become the best versions of themselves. And that, she realized, was the most important lesson of all. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.